Welcome to this explainer. Today we're doing something a little different. We're not just looking at what we know about the universe and the human mind, we're digging into how we actually know it. It's like looking at the absolute bedrock of human knowledge, where the rigid rules of physics crash right into the messy, complex depths of psychology. Let's get right into it.
So we have to start with the big one, the massive, universal question that basically kicked off the entire philosophy of science. How, and honestly why, does the world work? We've always looked to science to sort of pop the hood on reality, right? To explain the mechanics of the universe, our minds, and our bodies. And this modern flavor of scientific explanation, it really got its start with Isaac Newton. He was on this epic quest to find just a handful of mathematical laws to explain gravity and motion. And in doing so, he kind of set the gold standard for how we define our reality.
Here's our roadmap for the explainer. We'll start big with the search for explanation, unlocking the laws of nature, and looking at the anatomy of theories. From there, we'll zoom in on what happens when scientific theories actually clash, how we write psychology's history, and finally, why studying all this past drama directly shapes our modern minds.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the search for explanation.
Drawing some inspiration from the foundational lectures over at University Malaysia's Sabah, we can see that expecting science to flawlessly explain our universe isn't some new trend, it's a deeply rooted human endeavor. We rely heavily on the philosophy of science to help us peek behind the curtain and understand exactly how science builds these explanations behind the scenes.
Now, check out the direct contrast between these two major scientific mindsets. It's fascinating. On one side, you've got the nomological approach. These folks essentially just want to describe the world exactly as we experience it. Keep it simple, right? But then, on the flip side, you have the causal approach. Scientific realists love this one. They demand to know the hidden why. They want to penetrate the actual causal structure of reality. To them, scientific theories need to reflect the true physical entities of the universe, not just act as handy prediction tools.
But actually, this brings us to a third way of looking at it, the pragmatic perspective. And I love this because it argues that scientific explanations are really just social events. Take the classic question, why is the sky blue? If a little kid asks, saying, because it's the prettiest color, is genuinely a great answer. But an older kid, they might learn about bending light. Fast forward to high school, it's all about frequencies and refraction, and then college physics hits you with the precise math. The point is, none of these are inherently wrong. Whether an answer is right depends entirely on who is asking and the context of the conversation. Our explanations simply scale up as our science does.
Moving right along to Section 2, unlocking the laws of nature.
Okay, so enter Auguste Comte and the concept of positivism. Comte looked at how unbelievably well Newton's physics worked and thought, hey, every single human endeavor should adopt that exact same methodology. For these early positivists, science had three and only three basic jobs. Description, which lets you make a prediction, which ultimately gives you control over nature. They were absolutely terrified of straying into unprovable woo-woo metaphysics, so their golden rule was to stick strictly to observable facts.
And right next door to that, we have naturalism. This is literally the bedrock of disciplines from physics all the way down to psychology. Naturalism insists that absolutely everything, yes, even incredibly complex stuff like human consciousness, altruism, and ethics, can be understood through empirical evidence and natural causes. It operates on this strict assumption that we simply do not need supernatural interventions to explain the reality we live in.
So, once we have these strict philosophical rules locked in, how do scientists actually go about building the theories they use? Let's get into Section 3. The anatomy of theories.
There has been this really fascinating evolution in how we view scientific theories. Back in the early 20th century, the syntactic view was all the rage. This treated theories like super strict, formal mathematical equations, very rigid. But, science is messy, and it usually progresses through approximations, right? So eventually we shifted to the semantic view. This approach argues that science actually relies on building and tweaking flexible models. Think of the famous Bohr model of the atom. Instead of just a wall of logical axioms, providing a conceptual model gives scientists the flexibility to represent wild, complex real-world phenomena much more naturally.
But what exactly happens when two of these flexible models, or theories, go head-to-head over the exact same thing? That brings us to Section 4, when scientific theories clash.
When theories clash, it is basically intellectual survival of the fittest. And usually there are two main outcomes. Sometimes a shiny new theory simply absorbs the old one. We call this reduction. The old theory isn't completely trashed, it just sort of becomes a special case within a newer, broader framework. But other times, the old theory is entirely overthrown, completely rejected as fundamentally misleading, and that is replacement. The old idea is simply out.
Having looked at the macro framework of science, let's zoom way in on a specific micro-battlefield in Section 5, Writing Psychology's History.
We're talking about the historiography of psychology. And honestly, it turns out that studying how the history of psychology is written is just as fiercely debated as the psychological theories themselves. Think about it. Who actually gets to write the history? And what kinds of biases are shaping the historical narrative that we just accept as fact today?
This breakdown highlights the three main lenses we use to view our past. First, do we use the great man approach? Focusing on isolated pioneers, like Wilhelm Wundt founding the first lab, even if that completely ignores the cultural influences around him? Or second, do we look at schools of thought, tracking the dramatic rise and fall of movements like behaviorism, even though that tends to oversimplify things? Or third, do we take a revisionist approach, like feminist historiography, to shine a spotlight on brilliant, previously overlooked contributors like Leda Stetter-Hollingworth?
And while we're digging through the past, we have to be incredibly careful of our own biases. It's so easy to fall into presentism, where we unfairly judge figures like Freud by today's modern scientific standards. The alternative is historicism, which tries to understand him in the context of his own era. We also have to choose between an internalist view, which focuses solely on the evolution of ideas, or an externalist perspective. And honestly, the externalist view is a huge one. It recognizes how massive outside forces totally shape scientific focus. Like, did you know the urgent practical needs of World War I were the direct spark for the massive rise in intelligence testing? Context is literally everything.
Which naturally leads us to Section 6, Why Study the Past?
So why does digging into this dense history actually matter to us right now? Well, knowing our history is literally our best defense. It actively protects us from repeating horrific ethical failures like the Tuskegee study or falling for wild pseudoscience like phrenology, measuring the bumps on someone's skull to figure out their personality. Yikes. It also lets us properly recognize the pioneers who truly shaped society. Take Mamie and Kenneth Clark, for example. Their psychological studies directly influenced the U.S. Supreme Court to strike down racial segregation. By looking backward, we actively build the critical thinking skills we need to move forward.
And this is exactly why academic institutions like the Faculty of Psychology and Social Work are absolutely essential. They guide this historiography. They teach us a vital lesson. Just because a theory like behaviorism was universally accepted as gospel in the past doesn't mean it's the final answer. Science isn't static. It's this incredibly active, ongoing evolution. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought to chew on. Based on the dramatic history of reduction and replacement that we've just walked through, which of our current, confidently held scientific facts do you think are simply waiting to be completely rewritten by the next generation? Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.